Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Calvin Leckelt. I'm the program lead for energy efficiency programs at the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Future of Electric Vehicles in Alberta webinar. Joining me on this webinar today is my colleague Tori Santucci, a project coordinator with our team, and he will be going through the details on the Action Center's EV funding program, other EV related tools and resources that we offer, and our interview with our very special guest, Jeff Turner with Dunsky Energy Consulting. As attendees are still in the process of joining the webinar, I'll just go over some quick housekeeping. We are using Microsoft Teams Live, so this means that your microphone and camera are off. If you do have any questions for our team or for our guest speaker, you can type them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available to all participants on the MCCAC website under our Learning Center in a couple of days. So before jumping in, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge that this presentation is being presented in Treaty 6 territory. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. We also acknowledge that we do have attendees from all across Canada, so we encourage all of you to just take a quick second and acknowledge the land and the Indigenous peoples of the region in which you are joining us today. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Action Center, we were established in 2009 as a collaborative initiative between the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, Rural Municipalities of Alberta, and the Government of Alberta. The Action Center provides funding, technical assistance, and education to Alberta municipalities, nonprofits, and schools in addressing climate change. So as for a few stats on the impact that the Action Center has had, we have worked with over 330 unique program participants on nearly 600 projects. We've helped create 435 jobs. We've supported the installation of 14 megawatts of solar capacity and funded projects that reduce over 380,000 tons of CO2 during their useful lifetimes. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague Tori to go over the agenda. Take it away, Tori.
Perfect. Thanks, Calvin, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. So we're going to get right into it. Talking about electric vehicles, first off, just to kind of give us a brief introduction as to why you even want to drive electric in the first place. And then we'll talk about the many supports that there are for electric vehicles. So things like our electric vehicles for municipalities program that we offer to municipalities, the federal incentive programs that are available, as well as some tools and resources that we have available on our website. And then the bulk of the webinar will be dedicated to speaking with our special guest, Jeff Turner. And once we've completed that, there'll be time at the end for some questions and answers from the participants. So if you do have a question in time, feel free to throw it into the question and answer chat box. So why would you even want to drive electric? Well, electric vehicles are, as you know, the next stage of evolution within the transportation sector. They're energy efficient technology that is rapidly improving. Their electric motors themselves in the EVs, they're about 85 to 90% efficient. Compare that to a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle or ICE vehicle. That's only about 25%.
Hey Tori.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. It seems as though we might not have sound. I just got a question saying no sound, and Haley can't hear any sound either.
Oh, sorry about that. You can hear me though, right?
I can hear you just fine, yeah.
Okay, hold on one sec here. Okay, well, if this is the problem, I can switch microphones. Hear me now?
I'm just asking her to let us know when she can hear. I can still hear you just fine.
Okay, let's try that. Maybe, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh,
and it looks like people in the queue can hear as well.
Can we hear as well? Awesome. Sorry about that, everyone.
Go ahead.
No worries. All right. So I'll just repeat what I said before. So thanks everyone, first of all, for joining us. And if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box as we go along. So just starting off, why would you want to drive electric? Electric vehicles are the next stage of evolution within the transportation sector. They are energy efficient technology that is rapidly improving. So comparing just even the electric motors in EVs, they're about 85 to 90% efficient versus a traditional ICE vehicle, or internal combustion engine for short. They're only about 25%. So big difference there in terms of just efficiency. And the fueling and maintenance costs are also much lower. There's no oil changes required for, say, a battery electric vehicle. There's the regenerative braking technology that's involved with EVs. There's less moving parts. So overall, just a better choice, and also with less trips to the local mechanic. They produce less greenhouse gas emissions, which improve local air quality, which is always a plus. And Canada, as well as other countries like China, France, Japan, they're all aiming to phase out fossil fuel cars and increase the availability of EVs. Specifically, Canada's target is about 100% of new EV sales by 2040. So lots going on, and it's really exciting to see the progress. So some of the funding that is available, first off, we got to start with a plug for our program, the Electric Vehicles for Municipalities program. This program is available to all Albertan municipalities to offset the capital costs of purchasing some of these electric vehicles. So any Albertan municipality can participate. What is eligible are the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and the battery electric vehicles. And we also fund level 2 and 3 charging stations and feasibility studies. What we don't fund are the traditional hybrids that you can't plug in. So for example, a Toyota Prius. We are not funding transit vehicles as well, just because they have many other funding streams available already. So there's 3 different streams of funding for electric vehicles in our program. Starting with the passenger, you can get either $7,000 or $14,000 available, depending on what the battery capacity is for that vehicle. So things like a Chrysler Pacifica or a Chevy Bolt would qualify. The heavy duty category is in the middle. So this category can fund various different vehicles. So things like garbage trucks, construction vehicles. The market for these is still in its infancy, but it's growing very rapidly, so we wanted to have a category for it. 30% of costs are covered for this category, up to $300,000 per vehicle. So examples could be a Lion 8, a BYD or a Mack LR refuse truck, and so on. And then the last category is the non-road vehicle category. This category spans many different types of vehicles, everything from electric ice resurfacers, ATVs, UTVs, golf carts, you name it. There's 30% of costs are available to be funded, up to $50,000 per vehicle. So things like a Zamboni or a Polaris Ranger would qualify. We also fund charging stations, 50% of the costs, up to $2,000 per station, level 2 or 3 only, and it must be purchased with an electric vehicle. And lastly, feasibility studies are also eligible for funding. We fund 50% of those costs, up to $66,000 per study. There's 1 study allowed per municipality, and you must use our pre-qualified consultants list to do so. So all 3 initiatives are capped across per municipality, so it's $750,000 per municipality for this program. Moving on, there's also the federal electric vehicle incentive programs. So you may have heard that the feds are giving away $2,500 to $5,000, and these are point of sale incentives. So depending on the battery capacity of the electric vehicle you're buying, you'll receive those incentives when you purchase the vehicle. And there's also the ZVIP program, the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that's currently available now. There's up to 50% of costs covered, $100,000 per organization for level 2 or higher charging stations. And the cool thing about these programs is that you can actually stack them with our EVM program. So if you were to purchase a battery electric vehicle like a Chevy Bolt, you could potentially receive up to $19,000 off the purchase.
or in rebates, I should say. So some tools and resources that are available. First off, we have an electric vehicle savings calculator that's available on our Learning Center and in the EVM program webpage. What this is just an Excel file that you can download, and it will tell you all of the savings that can be attributed to switching from an internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle. So you fill in some of the information there in green at the top, and then you pick your electric vehicle, you pick your ICE vehicle, and then you click this little button on the right-hand side to compute the savings, and you get everything that you would want to know about switching and what kinds of savings are involved. Some fuel costs, maintenance, GHGs, and as you can see, that can be quite significant. We also have the electric vehicle knowledge guide available. So this is a fairly large document that we have on the Learning Center as well, and it's got a lot of great information about electric vehicles. If you're completely new to them or you want to brush up on some of it, it's got some great information. So things like best practices for deploying electric vehicles, some of the various vehicles that are available on the market today, some frequently asked questions. There's a lot of great information there, so check that out if you haven't already. And with that, we will now begin the interview portion of the webinar featuring our special guest, Jeff Turner from Dunsky Energy Consulting. He is the Senior Research Lead at that company. So please, thank you very much, Jeff. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you guys.
So Jeff, maybe you could just give us a quick introduction and a bit of background about some of the work that you've done so far.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So just to start, I work for Dunsky Energy Consulting. I'm a senior research lead there and our lead on clean mobility. And some of you might be familiar with Dunsky from our long history of working in the energy efficiency and renewable space. I've been with the company for almost 4 years now, and since then we've added an additional focus on clean mobility. And our primary focus in clean mobility is certainly on vehicle electrification. This is the biggest opportunity that we see in the mobility space, and it's also the primary focus of my career. So, you know, at Dunsky, we've been doing a lot of work with folks across Canada and in the US, primarily working with utilities and different levels of governments, basically helping them understand the barriers to adoption of electric vehicles across different vehicle segments, and helping them to understand the role that they can play in addressing those barriers. So a lot of work, for example, forecasting the potential adoption, getting a sense of where the market is going, understanding the costs and benefits of EVs in different segments, and certainly a big focus on charging infrastructure as well. Prior to joining Dunsky, I was actually out on the west coast of Canada, out in Vancouver, working for BC Hydro's PowerTech Labs, sort of an R&D subsidiary of BC Hydro, where we were deploying charging infrastructure across BC and also testing out a range of different technologies that can minimize the impact of EVs on the grid. And prior to that, I also worked for a company called Azure Dynamics that was building hybrid and electric commercial vehicles, delivery vans and trucks and things like that. So it's been yeah, it's been the focus of my career ever since my doing my undergrad at McGill University. And in fact, when I was there, my very first projects on electric vehicles were all about electric snowmobiles. So I've thinking more than just cars and trucks. And actually, I don't know, maybe you want to pass to the next slide. I think we had a photo of my own EV. So I live in rural Quebec, about an hour south of Montreal. And I drive a Chevy Bolt, which is a great car, nice compact hatchback with about 400 kilometers of range. And got some weird feedback there. And yeah, this is a shot of us using our Bolt to boost we've got a big old diesel tractor that we use. We live down on a farm. And yeah, our Bolt has come in handy boosting our decrepit combustion powered vehicles that are a little bit older and have tired batteries. So this has been a really useful tool for us to use our Bolt as a mobile energy source. And you know, that certainly ties back to some of the work that we do, where, you know, we like to acknowledge the fact that these vehicles have a lot of energy stored on board, and this can actually be really useful, like this in some cases where you need power in a remote area where there's no access to electricity. But also, of course, when you're in a place connected to the grid, EVs can potentially play a very valuable role for the grid as a flexible load and potentially even a source of storage. So yeah, all that to say, I'm speaking about EVs from a rural perspective, so I'm sympathetic to what that means in some of the more remote parts of and rural parts of Alberta, and how EVs can make sense there as well. So with that, maybe I'll pass back to you, Tori, if we want to dive into some of the interview questions. Looks like you're on mute.
Yeah, we might be having some more sound issues, so I can fill in while Tori is getting that settled. So yeah, that's a lot of really great feedback. I think it's particularly really interesting to hear about your perspective as it relates to driving in a rural setting. So yeah, could you talk a little bit more about what are like some of the most the highlights of you driving electric? What do you like most about your Bolt and your experience with that?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I think Tori touched on some of the more obvious benefits. I think a lot of people think of EVs as a way to minimize your environmental footprint and a way to save on fuel costs. So those are obviously really important and major factors in our decision to get an EV. But I'd say on some of the less obvious stuff, I mean, first and foremost, the convenience of waking up to a full charge every morning is amazing. I used to have to, plan a detour to the gas station at least once a week, and my commute is now a lot easier because I always know that I've got enough juice to get to work and back. Even with my long commute, I've got about a 150-kilometer round trip. So that's really convenient, and I think any EV driver will emphasize that, especially for fleets as well, when they realize that the staff at an organization, they don't need to worry about whether or not they're going to pull out a fleet vehicle and find that it needs a top up. And besides that, it's also just really fun to drive. It's very responsive, it's very smooth, and there's no shifting or anything. And a funny story, I actually just had a visitor this weekend, an old friend from engineering school. He's in the mining equipment business, and he came out with his, he's got maybe a 10-year-old Porsche 911, and we traded a bit of a guilty pleasure to go for a nice drive in his Porsche. But when we got back, he took the Bolt for a spin, and he was very impressed. It's got a lot of pickup, even at high speeds, and he told me to tell any skeptics that this Porsche owner was very impressed with the fun drive aspect of this EV.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah, I'm hearing you loud and clear.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Sorry about that. Had some microphone issues, but I switched over to a different one. That's some great context, Jeff. So I guess maybe just kind of taking a step back for a little bit, and then kind of looking at what's going on internationally. Could you tell us about what some of the adoption trends you are seeing and observing, and who are the leaders in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, so I've been working on EVs since about 2005. So I've witnessed the transition from these being very much a science project that, not many people have heard about to, now we're at a point where even, the US presidential debate, they talked about EVs last night. So I think this has clearly become much more of a mainstream topic. And largely because we're seeing impressive ongoing growth in EVs across the world. And it's been interesting to watch. I think in the early 2010s through to 2015, the US was the #1 market for EVs. And if anything, since then we've only seen other markets, especially China and now more recently Europe, catch up and even surpass the US. So we're now at a point where there are some markets that are doing very well. I think a lot of people have probably heard about Norway as being by far the best market for EVs in the world. They're at the point now where 70% of the vehicles sold in Norway are plug-in electric. So the majority of new vehicle sales are electric at this point. And I think that's important to remember anytime anybody asks about whether EVs can work in a cold climate like ours. So Norway is a relatively small market, but even some of the other major markets in Europe, like France, Germany, and the UK, are also starting to catch up to the point that now across Europe, the average market share for EVs has hit about 10%. So 1 out of 10 vehicles sold in Europe are now a plug-in vehicle. Here in North America, we're not quite as far as that. Canada-wide, I think we're at about 3% market share. So still fairly early days. The leading markets in Canada are certainly Quebec and BC, where both those provinces are now approaching the 10% market share level. And so in those cases, those are two provinces that have had a lot of pieces in place for a number of years. They've offered financial incentives. They've moved very quickly on charging infrastructure, and they even have policies that require automakers to meet minimum targets in terms of making those vehicles available. But outside of those three provinces, Alberta is actually the best of the rest. So we're not quite at 1% market share in Alberta, but we're getting there. And the year-over-year growth that we've seen, I think first quarter 2020 was about 50% higher sales than in 2019. So overall, I think we're seeing very promising progress. You know, I think the trends are obvious. We know where this is going. It's just a question of exactly how quickly sales are going to continue to accelerate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of touched on it already, but we were hoping to get into maybe like what's being done necessarily in Canada. Is there, we're seeing obviously an increase in the number of EVs on the road here at home, and we know that the Canadian government has actually set some pretty ambitious federal targets. I think they said something like 10% of light duty vehicles will be available by 2025, 30% by 2030, and 100% by 2040. So given the uptake that you've seen in some of the more popular provinces where they're seeing a large uptake, how close do you think we are at achieving some of these electric vehicle goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, first of all, setting those targets is an important first step. Until we do that, we don't really know we don't really have anything to measure ourselves against. So I think it was really helpful that Canada set those targets. And it's worth noting that those are actually the same targets that BC has set. The difference being that BC has actually legislated those as requirements on the industry. So that's an important distinction. But over there in BC, I think it's exciting to see that they're almost already hitting their 2025 target. They're already pretty much at 10% market share. So when we've done some modeling across Canada, we've found that those targets that Canada has set, they're definitely achievable. You know, if we can continue to see the kind of support that we've seen so far. And certainly a key piece of the equation there, you know, I mentioned some of the programs and measures that BC and Quebec have put in place, including financial incentives. I think we finally had a crucial step last year when the federal government introduced a $5,000 incentive nationwide. I've been, over and over again, I've been repeating how we're so far behind the US on that front. The US has offered a $7,500 incentive since around 2010, and that's actually been maintained through several changes in government. So I think Canada had some room to catch up on that front, but I'm happy to see the pieces are starting to fall into place, and that's really helping out in the provinces outside of those leading jurisdictions like Alberta. So I think it's great that there finally is some money on the table in Alberta. And I think that's really definitely going to help to move the ball forward.
Right. So just kind of getting into more of the electric vehicle charging station side, what's your opinion on that? How does availability and visibility of having these charging stations available, how does that influence EV adoption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think right off the bat, we know that this is one of the first things that non-EV drivers ask about. The first thing they want to know is, if I get an EV, where do I charge it? But the first thing any EV driver will answer is that, well, you're going to charge it at home. For the vast majority of people, especially in Alberta, that have a driveway, it's really easy to install a charging station at home. And like I mentioned earlier, it's really convenient to wake up to a full charge in the morning. So that's the number one answer. But nevertheless, it's those non-EV drivers that we need to convince that an EV can fit with their lifestyle. So this is absolutely crucial. Some folks have been questioned the degree to which deploying charging stations can accelerate EV adoption. Some question whether it's really a notion of building it and they will come. And I think to a certain extent, you can agree that, you know, just putting charging stations out there isn't on its own going to make people want to switch to an EV, but it is an essential piece of the puzzle. And if the other pieces are in place, meaning that EVs have become affordable, whether that's thanks to government incentives in the early days and over time, ongoing decreasing costs and purchase prices for EVs, alongside you know, increasing consumer awareness, making sure that there is charging infrastructure out there so that people can make those longer trips, even if it's not something that you do on a very regular basis. People need to know that they can make that once a year trip to visit grandma somewhere far off. And also what's crucial, I think there's a lot of focus on that early step of establishing geographic connectivity. but it's also important to make sure that the capacity of that charging network is sufficient as the volume of EVs on the market grows. And so in some of the leading jurisdictions, we've already started to see lineups at charging stations. So that's something that we need to pay attention to as well, beyond just laying down that first base layer to provide geographic connectivity across a region.
Yeah, that's certainly a great point. And I know to all of our rural Albertan listeners out there that are looking for a charging station in their area, sometimes that might not be, they might not be in the most convenient places and things like that. So do you have any advice on, how they could kind of come together and have these charging stations in place where they need them, like you said, when they need to make these big, long trips?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's been some good progress in Alberta, and certainly some parts of the province have a good layer, but there are large stretches of the province that aren't really covered yet. The good news is that there's a lot of funding on the table right now, especially from the federal government. And I think the speech from the throne that we heard recently identified ongoing investment charging infrastructure as a key step, both for stimulating the economy, because this is really, these are shovel-ready projects that can lead to job growth in the near future, but also, really tackling some key barriers to adoption. So I think that's really encouraging, and any municipalities that are looking to break down further barriers to adoption of EVs certainly can look to the federal government as a willing partner with funding on the table. So I think that's certainly something that a number of local stakeholders in Alberta can help solve those problems. And we do a lot of work on this, figuring out how much charging infrastructure is needed. And I'm always quick to remind everyone that it's the folks on the ground in these communities that are going to have the best understanding of where this infrastructure should go. We've seen some studies that have done kind of pie in the sky analysis of like how to optimize exactly where this infrastructure should go. But ultimately, you really need those local decision makers at the table, because they're going to have the understanding of what are the trips, what are the routes and corridors that need to be covered, and what are the convenient locations that people can work into a quick stop to charge up that can actually fit in pretty well with their routine.
Mm-hmm. One other barrier that I think we've encountered as well, not just here in Alberta, but I think in all across the country and even the world, is the price of electric vehicles right now. Given that they are currently more expensive than their internal combustion engine vehicle counterparts, do you know when EVs are expected to actually reach price parity with their traditional vehicle counterparts? And once they do, is there really any reason to actually buy a traditional gasoline powered or diesel powered vehicle anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that we've had the opportunity to dive into this year with the provincial government that's looking at the idea of financial incentives for EVs. And of course, the incremental cost difference between an electric vehicle, the purchase price of the electric vehicle versus a combustion vehicle, that is the crucial barrier that an incentive program is meant to address. And yes, absolutely, we know that prices of EVs are coming down quickly. We've seen the price that progress over the past few years, and everyone knows that this is a trend that we'll continue to see. Nobody knows the exact date when they're going to cross over. And of course, it's a little bit more complicated because there are different vehicle types. We're starting to see SUVs and pickup trucks on the market. And even within a given category of vehicle, for example, a shorter range EV is likely to be hit that price parity sooner because the battery is so much smaller. There are some forecasts out there that have said we'll be hitting price parity around 2025 or even earlier. Our own model is a little bit more conservative on that. I think we see true price parity happening a little bit after 2025, depending on the vehicle category, maybe even as late as 2030 in some vehicle categories. But what's important to remember is that we're talking about the upfront price. And that is absolutely important, especially for personal vehicles. But what's important to remember is the total cost of ownership. And I'm sure anybody that uses the fleet fuel savings calculator that you mentioned earlier, they'll find that you can save on the order of $1,000 to $2,000 a year on fuel. And when you factor that into the decision making, that can mean that on a total cost of ownership basis, EVs are pretty much at price parity today, depending on the usage profile. Now, all that said, that's not the only barrier. I think there are other factors besides the price and the economics. But I think once those pieces fall into place, it's going to be really hard to argue against switching to an EV. When the economics just become so favorable. I know personally, we besides the tractor, we've also got an old 15-year-old pickup truck, and we paid $2,500 for that truck, which is exactly how much we saved in fuel the previous year with our EV. So I think that's we can't. It's hard to turn away from those fuel savings.
Yeah. For sure. Do you think incentives play a role in electric vehicle uptake at this point, just to kind of counter the higher price point? And what point do you think that incentives may not even be worth it because they are just as expensive or even lower or cheaper as the traditional counterparts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, our recent analysis found that for a car, the incremental cost for an EV right now, if you take away incentives, is on the order of $12,000 to $14,000, and it's even higher than that as we look at SUVs and pickup trucks that have larger batteries. So absolutely, incentives are essential right now. I think it's without those incentives in place, it's hard for people to make the case, even when they consider fuel savings. And frankly, maybe over the total cost of ownership, you might save some money, but a lot of folks are looking at that upfront purchase is a lot more front of mind, and it's even if they know they might save money 5-10 years down the road. So yeah, our analysis suggested that incentives are absolutely a critical tool in terms of accelerating the market and actually building up some momentum in the market. And globally speaking, this is really crucial to drive up volumes of sales so that manufacturers are actually able to achieve the economies of scale that are factored into those forecasts that say that battery costs are going to come down. So incentives are absolutely essential at this point. And I think the important thing is, again, I'll point to the US, where they've had incentives for a number of years, maintaining incentives over time and providing a transparent, gradual process for phasing them out. I think that's really helpful so that folks in the industry, consumers, purchasers of vehicles, and the industry who are producing these vehicles, they have some visibility and certainty of, where the market is going to be.
Right. No, that's a great point. And speaking of the batteries in the vehicles, this can kind of be kind of a contentious point too, because we know that electric vehicle batteries use various chemicals and rare earth metals that need to be taken care of, and when they have reached their end of their useful life. So you really have two options. You can kind of recycle them or repurpose them. So do you know what parts of the battery can actually be recycled or repurposed, and what's being done to ensure that these are actually being properly taken care of?
Yeah, that's a great question. One quick detail, it's a pet peeve of mine. A lot of people focus on rare earth metals, and it's actually, there's not really much content of rare earth metals in batteries. It's actually the permanent magnets and motors that rely on rare earth metals. Whereas the batteries themselves, I mean, the materials that we're talking about there are largely aluminum, cobalt, nickel, lithium. A lot of these materials have been in the news lately because, I think there's a lot of attention on progress in batteries and the materials required there. These materials are all getting an increasing amount of attention as demand for these materials are skyrocketing, essentially. The scale of production of batteries is really increasing. And that also means that recycling of these batteries is becoming increasingly interesting. These are really valuable metals that we're taking a lot of effort to dig out of the ground and process them, whereas the batteries themselves, they're all right there, and these materials actually can be recycled. That said, we're still at its infancy. And I think what helps to understand this is the fact that, for the most part, these batteries will last in a vehicle from somewhere on the order of 10 to 15 years. And that means that we're only now starting to reach the end of life of the few thousand of EVs that were sold back in 2010. So there's really not a very big market for that right now. And while there are a number of companies that are positioning themselves to be leaders in the space, including a former Tesla executive, but also there's Retrieve Technologies over in the Kootenays that have been operating in the space for a number of years. There's lithium recycling here in Quebec. And they're really starting to figure out the processes that they're going to put in place to manage the stream of batteries that we're going to start to see as vehicles start to retire. Now, all that said, even before we get to that point, and you mentioned it right here, the question about repurposing batteries. And to help make that, just to drive that point home, most automakers, they warranty their batteries to last, say, 8 to 10 years. And they say that within that time frame, the battery is guaranteed to maintain at least 70 to 80% of its capacity. So that battery, when it's deemed to be, outside of warranty, it's violating its warranty and not performing to expectations, that is still enough capacity to power a home for several days. So even though that battery might not longer meet expectations in terms of the range that you might expect from an EV, there's still a lot of valuable roles that battery can play in a stationary application, either providing backup power to a home or maybe even in a more of a grid-focused storage system that can provide services to the grid. So I think there's a lot of promise here, both on the recycling front, but even before we get there, on the second life the battery can play outside of its first life in a vehicle.
Mm-hmm. Or even maybe to charge a tractor as well.
Absolutely, I could probably replace those old lead acid batteries in the back of our tractor with some spent EV batteries. And
yeah, that's great. Shifting gears a little bit, talking specifically about Alberta. Obviously, you know as well that electric vehicle uptake in Alberta has been a lot slower when compared to other provinces, say like Ontario or BC or Quebec. In your opinion, just from sort of an outside perspective, what are the greatest barriers to electric vehicle uptake in Alberta, and how can they be addressed and overcome?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that's obvious, I mentioned earlier on some of the other provinces, and so Alberta certainly did miss out on that kickstart to the market that you can get by offering a financial incentive. So Ontario, Quebec, and BC offered significant amounts of money for financial incentives. Even in Ontario, where the incentives were canceled in 2018, and certainly sales dropped precipitously immediately after that cancellation. But where they're at today, we're now seeing evidence that that incentive, even though it was temporary, it really helped to move them along. So I think Alberta has missed out on that kickstart so far. But that said, this market is progressing gradually, and I think there's a lot of promise in Alberta, especially when you consider the fact that the vast majority of Albertans have a driveway, and so they can count on being able to charge at home, with a few exceptions in some of the more urban areas in the province. I think a number of initiatives have actually been covered pretty well. So at least in some parts of the province, charging infrastructure is picking up. There's a decent network that can get you out to the Rockies and through southern Alberta. So I think on a number of fronts, things are starting to look up. That said, I think there's a lot of room to improve on two fronts. One is on the education front. I think there's probably still a big lack of awareness of the benefits of EVs in the province and how they can actually fit in, especially as we're starting to see an increasing availability of different models. And then on that question of availability, we did some work recently with the federal government that looked at the supply of EVs in dealerships across Canada. And we found that outside of Quebec and BC, 4 out of 5 dealerships don't have any EVs in stock. And this is a major barrier to adoption. So even folks that are just becoming interested and trying to figure out whether an EV could fit into their life, if they go into a dealership, they're not necessarily going to even see any models, let alone a motivated salesperson who's going to help them walk through all the information that they'll need to learn. So the supply of vehicles is definitely a major challenge, and I think this is something that we can break through naturally over time with increasing momentum in the market. But certainly there's been some focus on policies that can kind of basically require the industry to provide a minimum amount of supply to ensure that supply is there to meet the demand that there is.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I like that you touched on the incentives. It just kind of shows you how important they are when you're first getting started and want to increase that uptake. So speaking of things that some barriers in Alberta. Another sort of contentious point that we keep hearing about, a common argument is that in Alberta, electric vehicles won't actually reduce emissions because they're powered largely by a fossil fuel powered grid, or fossil fuel dominant rather. So how would you respond to such an argument?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that I've been looking at since my studies at McGill University. I did my first what's called a well-to-wheels analysis on EV emissions back around 2008. And what's great about this is that there's plenty of data to answer these questions. We know how much energy an EV takes, And we know how much pollution is emitted when we generate electricity in different parts of the grid. And likewise, we know the typical fuel efficiency of a gas-powered vehicle. The analysis that we've done has shown that even today, an EV is already better than the best gas-powered vehicle in Alberta. And one thing that's important to remember, of course, when we're doing this analysis, absolutely we should be considering, how is the electricity generated? But what often gets left out of the equation is the emissions associated with producing and distributing gasoline, which also has an impact. But I think nitpicking over exactly where we're at today, some studies disagree over exactly how beneficial it is with today's grid mix. I think that misses the point, because we all know that we're working hard on decarbonizing the grid, and both the cleaning up electricity and electrifying transportation are two massive transformations that are going to take a decade or two to complete. And there's absolutely no reason one has to happen after the other. These should be tackled in parallel. And we know that, by the end of the life of a vehicle, it's going to be that EV is going to be even cleaner than it was when it was first purchased, because of the commitments that we're all making to transition towards renewable electricity. So I think it's a pretty easy argument to squash at this point, because any forecast for the grid emissions intensity by say 2030, by then it's going to be very clear that over the life of a vehicle bought today, it's going to have lower overall emissions than a gas-powered car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think there was even a study done from the Simon Fraser University that said that EVs, even driving with a mixed Alberta electricity grid, can still reduce your GHGs by about 41%. And that percentage is only going to get better as we transition to renewable electricity generation over time.
And honestly, I think one of the more exciting aspects is the fact that EVs can actually help accelerate the transition towards renewable energy. I think some of the concerns around renewables is their variable nature. We know that the sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing. But what's exciting about EVs is that they can provide a very valuable, flexible asset for the grid. If we have a fleet of electric vehicles that are plugged in either during the day at work or at home overnight, they can play a role in smoothing out fluctuations. I've already got the charge station that I have in my house can respond to signals that will tell it when to charge or when to slow down charging. Off-the-shelf technology today can turn an EV into a flexible load that is extremely valuable for any grid that's looking to accommodate an increasing percentage of renewable energy.
Awesome. So getting back into, we touched on this when we discussed the charging stations. Range anxiety, that tends to be a big counterpoint that we hear quite often, and could even be a barrier to electric vehicle adoption, especially in some of the more rural Albertas and municipal districts. So what considerations would you suggest implementing to kind of mitigate range anxiety in these municipalities, or even what information could you give about that?
Well, I think first of all, the number one thing is to make sure that every vehicle is starting its day with a full charge. And we've seen a few fleets make the mistake of buying EVs without much of an eye towards how they're going to recharge them, and it's kind of an afterthought. So making sure that vehicle has a charge station and it can start its day with a full day will really help on this front. And then at that point, you're talking about, at this point, pure electric vehicles have a range of on the order of 300 to 400 kilometers. Certainly that is reduced in the winter when there's a lot of energy used to heat the vehicle, but at a minimum, easily 200, 250 kilometers in the worst case. At that point, it's, there may be some roles in a municipal fleet where you need more than that to get everything done, but I think the vast majority of fleet vehicles that we've seen cover significantly less than that on a typical day. And certainly over time, we're starting to see EVs hit the market with 500, 600 kilometers of range, or even 800, I think is the latest top of the line models. So the growing battery capacity of EVs is quickly making range anxiety a bit of a non-issue for a lot of applications. That said, if you do have an application that is particularly high usage, is required to travel in remote locations, ensuring that there are charging facilities at satellite facilities can certainly help make sure those vehicles are topping up during the day. But honestly, if none of this is working for you, then plug-in hybrids are the best of both worlds. This is a vehicle that can have enough electric range to cover a typical day, maybe 50 to 80 kilometers of range on EV mode. And if you're going further than that, the gas engine just starts up automatically and can be used just like a gas car and fuel up as you would any other car. So I think with those two technologies, battery electric vehicles with very long range, and not to mention the ability to charge up in a half an hour with the right infrastructure, plus plug-in hybrids that have gasoline or diesel powered backup. I think it's really hard to find that corner case where you can't make a plug-in vehicle work in a fleet application.
Awesome. Those are great points. Shifting gears more towards the municipal side of things, municipalities obviously use a large range of vehicle types across their fleets, including things like heavy-duty electric vehicles that we fund through our program, things like garbage trucks and construction vehicles. Have you heard of any technological developments that are occurring with heavy-duty electric vehicles?
Yeah, well, I think to me the most exciting one is the one that you mentioned there with electric garbage trucks. I think we just saw the news that New York City's first electric garbage truck just entered into service. We've had the chance to speak with the fleet folks down with New York City, and they're very excited about that. That's a really good application for electric vehicles because this is a vehicle that spends a lot of time stopping and starting all day long. Any EV driver will tell you how nice it is to benefit from regenerative braking. That means that when the vehicle is slowing down, rather than using the friction brakes, the electric motor is able to operate as a generator and recharge the battery as you're slowing down. So that reduces wear and tear in the brakes, and it also extends your range. Whereas in a diesel-powered truck, that energy, that momentum that you put into the vehicle in acceleration is all lost every time you come to a stop. So electric garbage trucks is a really promising application, and we're seeing an increasing number of products hit the market from both startups like folks like Lion based here in Quebec, but also you mentioned the M.ENG electric truck, and that's the model that New York City is using. So I think there's a lot of promise there with garbage trucks. It's a really promising application. Another application that I've been paying close attention to for a number of years is bucket trucks, or the types of trucks that electric utilities might use to work on the lines, but I know a lot of municipalities use these for tree clearing work. So it's still a little bit earlier on in the days and not as many commercial offerings on that front, but the few offerings that are out there, we've spoken to a few fleets that have piloted electric bucket trucks. And one of the benefits they've highlighted to us is the benefit of being able to operate silently, so that they're not having to idle the vehicle to operate the hydraulics on the vehicle. And in some cases, this has actually allowed them to extend their operating hours, whereas they would have been previously required to stop operating during the evening if they're operating in a residential area. They've been able to extend their operating hours and stay on the site until they get a job done. Because they're able to operate this machine silently. So I think there's some really promising advances in the medium and heavy duty vehicle segments.
Mm-hmm. The silent garbage trucks really appeals to me for all the trucks that come by my house earlier in the morning.
As long as you weren't relying on the audio cue to remind yourself to put the garbage out.
Yeah, exactly. So these are really great points, Jeff. Talking about municipalities again, how would you suggest to try to convince municipal staff that introducing EVs into their fleet is a worthwhile endeavor, and who should be kind of involved with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, certainly the motivations are going to vary from one municipality to the next. I think first and foremost, absolutely any municipality that's looking to get a handle on their corporate emissions, I think they'll find that their vehicle fleet is probably one of the larger sources of emissions, and electric vehicles are a really promising way to tackle those emissions, but also do it in a way that can really serve as an example for the broader community. And we know a lot of fleets have made a point of branding their vehicles to highlight the benefits of these vehicles, both in terms of greenhouse gases, but also in terms of their air quality impacts. But for municipalities that are a little bit more focused on the bottom line, I think it's really encouraging to see the potential for savings on electric vehicles, especially if there's money on the table in the form of an incentive program. I think a lot of municipalities would find that this is a very good use of taxpayer dollars to make sure that they're electrifying their fleet, minimizing their fuel costs, minimizing their maintenance costs as well. EVs are roughly about half the cost to maintain. And I think they'll find that they can really build a positive business case for electrifying their fleet, especially if they take a closer look at the specific roles within their fleet and which are the best vehicles best candidates for electrification. And then in terms of who should be involved, yeah, this is interesting because I think we start to see a bit of a mix of different stakeholders within a municipal government. Certainly folks responsible for the fleet itself, but this introduces you know, an interesting relationship now between the fleet team and the folks responsible for facilities, because as I mentioned, it's really essential to make sure that EVs are purchased with an eye towards how they're going to be recharged. And so having the facilities team at the table to help plan for that infrastructure is absolutely essential. And you know, even just as simple as understanding, okay, the people who used to pay the fuel bill, that probably fell on the responsibility for the fleet team. Now the facilities folks are going to see an increase in their utility bill. So it's going to be important to coordinate across those different departments to make sure they understand who's taking on responsibility for the cost of operations for these vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Given the whole COVID-19 situation that we're currently in, do you see these electric vehicles fitting into sort of a municipal economic recovery plan at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this has been something that we've been really focused on at Dunsky at the federal level. We've been participating in some groups that are helping the federal government to think through the economic stimulus. And even down at the municipal level, I think these are absolutely a smart move. First and foremost, just in terms of the amount of work that's required to make sure that the infrastructure is there for these vehicles. These are, you know, shovel-ready projects that electricians and other trades can help tackle. I think there's a lot of work to do because whether they're commercial buildings or residential buildings, we're at a point now where it makes sense that basically every parking stall in a building, at some point, we know it's probably going to be supporting an electric vehicle, a plug-in vehicle, in the not too distant future. So we can really get a head start on this by making sure our buildings are ready, rolling out these retrofits of these existing buildings to make sure that they're ready to accommodate electric vehicles. And that could be a really helpful, constructive way to get people back to work in a way that's really going to set us up for success in the future. And more broadly, I think bigger picture, I think, you know, obviously the COVID crisis is make sure we're paying careful attention to the impact of air quality in our communities. And, you know, I think a lot of our attention is focused on greenhouse gases, but certainly when it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles, they have an outsized impact on air quality. And so that's a really important benefit that we like to emphasize. And I think that directly, you know, it impacts folks with respiratory challenges. And so I think this is just helps us put, you know, even more of a focus on making sure that we're doing our best to minimize the impact of our vehicles on air quality.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good point that you made about talking about them in terms of having charging stations available in particular facilities. I know BC, for example, does have a dedicated charging infrastructure policy that's built into the building codes and things like that when they go to plan for these things. So that's certainly a good point to mention for sure. We got one more question. I see we're running low on time here, so I'll ask you one last question here just to kind of come full circle. What excites you most about the future of electric vehicle technology in general?
So maybe two quick answers here. One, because I'm a bit of a technology geek, I am really excited about the progress on charging technologies. As I said, I think most people would remind you, most EV drivers would remind you that most of the charging happens at home. But I think it's really exciting to see the progress that we've seen over the past few years in fast charging technology. And we're now at a point where, you know, the first fast chargers that were put in ground and most of the fast chargers that are in the ground in Alberta so far, they can charge at a rate of 50 kilowatts. So that'll give you about 125 kilometers in half an hour, which is, you know, good enough to make a longer trip. But we're now starting to see charging stations that can charge 7 times as fast as that. And the first vehicles that can actually accept that much power are starting to enter the market now. So at that point, you're talking about a 300 to 400 kilometer charge in as little as 20 minutes or even faster. So I think that's really exciting. And I think that's really going to break down a lot of barriers to adoption. Again, I don't think we need to be in an arms race. And I think we need to remind people that, you know, 90% of the time you're just driving to work and back and charging at home. But I think when I think of the EV road trip, I like to go on EV road trips. And honestly, right now I have a 3-year-old son who likes to linger at charge stations and play at the park that's nearby. It'd be rare that we could get them back in the car within 15 minutes anyways, but I think this is going to be important for a lot of folks to be able to see an EV as something they can switch to and still really meet their expectations in terms of convenience. But besides that, I think I'm really excited about the diversity of vehicle types that are hitting the market. So far, a lot of the focus has been on small cars, and we're just now starting to see an increasing number of plug-in SUVs and crossovers, both pure electric and plug-in hybrid. And increasingly, more and more companies are coming to the table with plug-in pickup trucks. And that's including startups like Tesla and Rivian, but also traditional players like Ford and GM who have committed to launching plug-in pickup trucks in the next year or two. So that's really exciting.
Awesome. Really great stuff, Jeff. Thanks for that. So that brings us to kind of the end of our question and answer section with Jeff. But now we'd like to take some questions from the participants, if there are some. So I know my colleague Calvin was watching the chat box while we were having the discussion. So I might turn it over to Calvin to kind of address some of the questions that come in. And if you do have other questions, please type them in now. So over to you, Calvin.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tori. We do have quite a few questions. I apologize in advance if we don't have enough time to get to yours, but we will do our best. So one of the most liked comments here is that the government is funding the purchase of EVs, but electric utilities need to upgrade their infrastructure. Is there any funding for electric utilities? And maybe I'll pass that over to you, Jeff, because I think you'll be able to give a national perspective.
Yeah, this is a great question. In fact, a lot of the work that we do on EVs is for utility clients. If anything, the numbers that we've seen suggest that utilities actually have a really positive upside here. Yes, there might be some work required to make sure the infrastructure is ready to support a higher load, but overall, they're also going to be selling a lot more electricity to EV drivers. They're seeing a real positive business case in most cases for electrification. And the numbers that we've calculated here, and that we've done this in a number of different jurisdictions across Canada, in the prairies, out in the Maritimes, utilities overall stand to benefit from a transition towards electric vehicles. And that just basically means that, you know, this grid that we have, we're going to use it better. If we have vehicles that are charging overnight using capacity that's otherwise underutilized, utilities stand to receive greater revenue. And that revenue far surpasses any costs that they're going to incur in handling any additional peak load. So I think utilities are in a position to actually make a case for investing in accelerating EV adoption, which is really exciting for us.
Awesome. Next question comes from Jessie. She says, can you please expand on Canada's plans for all new vehicle sales to be electric by 2040? Is there a sales mandate in place or just a goal?
That's a great question. And no, the answer is that so far what Canada has at the national level is just a goal. And I think that's helpful for them to draw a line in the sand, but so far there are no teeth to that goal. This is not a requirement on the automakers to actually meet it, but I think it is a commitment, and I think we're expecting to see more details on how Canada actually plans to meet that goal in the near future, and we'll see whether they follow a similar path to what we've seen in BC and more recently California that have stepped up their goal to hit that target by 2035. But so far what we have in Canada at the national level is those are voluntary targets.
Right. Next question, from your experience, can you recommend or mention plug-in hybrid EV light trucks and SUVs with long range and very good reliability? In my rural municipality, we're looking at trying out a plug-in hybrid, but we feel only light trucks and SUVs will meet our needs because of the cabin space for equipment. Yeah, so can you speak to that?
Absolutely, yeah, this is something I've been watching very closely for a number of years. And I've been very excited this year, finally, because these SUVs and crossovers, they're the #1 selling segment in North America, more so than pickup trucks as a group. So just this year, with the launch of both the Ford Escape plug-in hybrid and the Toyota RAV4 plug-in hybrid, these are two of the most popular models out there. Both of those offer, you know, the benefits of being a plug-in hybrid. You don't have the range limitation of a pure electric vehicle, and you know, a decent cabin space that I think are a really good fit for municipal fleets.
Cool. So it looks as though a lot of our attendees are still hanging on. So I'm going to take that as a note that people want to hear their questions answered. So apologies for going a little bit over time, but we'll try to address a couple more before we wrap up. So next question is there already implementation or a plan to use EVs as a distributed generator to help the electric grid? And I know you touched on that a little bit, but what's actually happening in that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, so this has actually been a big focus of my career, especially my time at BC Hydro. A lot of my time there was focused on what's called broadly vehicle grid integration. And I like to draw a distinction between what some people might have heard, which is called vehicle to grid. And I think that might be what the listener is alluding to, the idea of a vehicle providing power back to the grid. And that's distinct from, there's a middle ground there that we can get to right today with existing technology. There's a lot of benefit to the grid if an EV is able to respond to signals and modulate when that charging happens. So if the EV hears that, okay, it's a peak event on the grid, the grid is approaching a status where it's going to be overloaded, EVs can respond to that and reduce their power. And that's something that utilities across North America and Europe are already doing today with available technology. So that's the low-hanging fruit here. Going to that next step of actually leveraging EVs as a mobile source of energy, that's what we call vehicle to grid. That's something that's a little bit more in its infancy. We have seen a number of trials here and there. It's certainly possible. Nothing stopping you from buying a Canadian Tire inverter and powering household appliances off of your EV if you've got one. But in terms of actually interconnecting that with the grid as you would a solar array, there's a little bit more red tape there in terms of making sure that EV is going to provide a reliable source of electricity onto the grid, and it's going to be safe and automatically disconnect in the case of an outage. But yeah, absolutely, this is something that's coming. We're at the stage of doing technology demonstrations, and it's not too far down the road before this is something that people can buy off the shelf, and it's just a question of utilities having the programs in place to accommodate that.
Great. Jesse also asks, what is Alberta and/or Canada doing to encourage electrification of medium and heavy-duty vehicles, but particularly private freight vehicles, not public fleets like transit and school buses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think so far it's been not quite as much of a focus. And I think this is something that a few different groups have been emphasizing, that the Canadian government and other governments should shift a bit more focus to medium and heavy duty vehicles. So far, NRCan does have a program called the Green Freight Assessment Program. And so they are offering funding both to do a study of a fleet's usage of vehicles, and also to provide funding for actual technology procurement. So whether that's technology to improve existing vehicles or new vehicle purchases. So there is an existing program from the federal government today, but I think we can expect that to increase, especially given that from an economic stimulus perspective, whereas we're just starting to see announcements of maybe some production of light duty vehicles, plug-in vehicles in Canada. What we do have a lot of is a number of bus and truck manufacturers that make EVs in Canada. So I think that's going to really motivate the Canadian government to accelerate adoption of those larger plug-in vehicles and reap the benefits in terms of economic development.
Yeah, for sure. I think we only have time for roughly 2 more questions. So the next one up here is, one concern that I have heard is that there aren't many mechanic shops that can work on EVs after warranty. So a dealership must do the work, generally at a higher cost. So although we talked about this, that EVs do have less maintenance, what would you suggest, or what is your experience with maintaining your Chevy Bolt?
That's a great question, and actually, it's a funny story because I'm in a rural area, and the nearest Ford Chevy dealer is quite a ways away. We do have a local mechanic here in the small town where I live, and the owner of this shop actually happens to drive a Chevy Bolt. So I'm in luck. He knows EVs, and he's been working to make sure his staff are getting trained up on this. And he's highlighted that it's actually a bit of a challenge for those independent shops because sure, the dealerships will get all the training they need from the automaker that they service. There's a bit of a gap there in terms of the training that's required for independent shops. So this is an issue. I think we're starting to see that breaking down, and certainly that's going to be part of some government's steps in terms of a stimulus to. I think that should be a part of the focus, anyways, in terms of supporting training and workforce training in this transition towards electric vehicles. So I think, yeah, there are some gaps, and I think right now that may be an issue in certain areas, but this is, I think municipal fleets, they're large players, and they can really play a role in helping to build the momentum that's necessary. And I think if a local dealership sees a fleet that's looking to acquire 10, 20, or 30 plug-in vehicles, that's going to be a clear signal that it's going to be worthwhile for them to get trained up so that they can actually offer those services to that fleet.
Yeah, absolutely. Scale will definitely help. So last question here is that EVs can be very difficult to find at Alberta dealerships. Do you have any recommendations for how to make EVs more accessible to Albertans who want to buy them or are considering buying them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mentioned the study that we just did for the federal government on exactly that issue. And no, it is a real challenge. And I think, at a national level or a provincial level, there are certainly policies that Quebec and BC have implemented to require automakers to step up and meet certain targets. Absent that, back to my point on the service front, I think momentum in the market is going to help to drive availability of these vehicles. So to whatever extent municipal fleets can get into this space, and like I said, I think those plug-in SUVs that are just starting to hit the market, that's going to fill a niche that has long been underserved. So a few municipal fleets in the province applying their weight on the scale and really greasing the wheels of the supply chain here can really help. And I think that can trickle down to consumers as well. So if the local fleet has purchased 20 or 30 plug-in hybrid SUVs, I think that's going to increase the chances that dealership is going to be in a better position to continue the flow of that supply and benefit local consumers in that area as well. So I think this is definitely something that, especially as a group, municipal fleets across the province working together on this front can really help make sure that those automakers recognize that there's demand there and help make sure that any constraints on supply are being addressed.
Absolutely, yeah, there's a lot of purchasing power there that could be leveraged. So apologies if we could not address your question. We'll move on to wrap up our webinar. I just want to touch on a handful of the other programs that the Action Center delivers, in addition to our Electric Vehicles for Municipalities program. So we do offer other renewable energy programs, such as the Alberta Municipal Solar Program, the Solar for Schools program, which are both microgen scaled solar PV rebate programs. And rounding out our energy efficiency programs are the Recreation Energy Conservation Program, where municipalities can receive funding to identify and implement energy efficiency projects in their recreation centers. And also our Municipal Energy Manager program that provides funding for municipalities to hire an in-house energy manager to track energy use, set saving targets, and be the lead for energy-related projects. And we also offer advisory services through a partnership with the the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for the Partners for Climate Protection program, which guides and supports municipalities through various milestones of climate action planning, including preparing GHG inventories, implementation plans, and more. So as we come to a close, we want to thank everyone for joining, and a very, very big thank you to our guest, Jeff, who provided really excellent insights on the future of EVs. I hope everyone was able to learn something new about EVs that they didn't know before, and that you all share in our excitement around the future of electric mobility. So really just to stay connected with us, please check out our social media channels to stay up to date with all of the work that we are doing, but also all of the great work that municipalities are leading all across the province, as we're always sharing different projects that municipalities are working on. So with that, I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thank you for tuning in.